Andrew Jackson arrived at the White House with blood on his hands and fury in his heart. The seventh president of the United States had already killed a man in a duel, beaten potential assassins with his walking stick, and carried a bullet lodged near his heart for decades. But the scandal that would define his presidency was only the beginning of a legacy written in violence and controversy. The Petticoat Affair erupted when Jackson's Secretary of War married a woman the Washington elite considered morally compromised. Jackson defended her honor with the same ferocity he'd shown on battlefields, tearing his entire cabinet apart in the process. His enemies whispered that he was repeating his own scandalous marriage, having wed Rachel Donaldson before her divorce was legally finalized, making them both technically adulterers in the eyes of the law. Rachel died just weeks after his election victory, and Jackson blamed his political enemies for literally killing her with their vicious attacks. The grieving president carried her memory like another bullet wound, never healing, always aching. His presidency became a crusade for her honor, fought with the same brutal tactics that had made him famous in duels and wars. But what came next shocked everyone. Jackson's war against the National Bank nearly destroyed the American economy. His treatment of Native Americans became a genocidal nightmare, and his explosive temper turned the White House into a battlefield where diplomats feared for their physical safety. Today, Jackson rests beneath a simple stone marker at the Hermitage in Tennessee, next to his beloved Rachel. The grave is surrounded by towering trees and peaceful gardens, a stark contrast to the violence that defined his life. Visitors often leave coins on his headstone, honoring the man who put his face on the $20 bill. Yet the inscription speaks only of love and devotion, carefully omitting the duels, the deaths, and the democracy he nearly shattered with his bare hands. James Buchanan entered the presidency as the nation's most experienced politician, having served as congressman, senator, minister to Britain, and diplomat to Russia. Yet within 4 years, historians would rank him as America's worst president, the man who watched his country tear itself apart while doing absolutely nothing to stop it. His personal scandals were whispered about in drawing rooms, but his political failures screamed from every battlefield of the Civil War. The bachelor president lived with Alabama Senator William Rufus King for 15 years in Washington, earning them the nickname the Siamese Twins from political rivals. When King died shortly after becoming vice president, Buchanan never formed another close relationship. Washington society buzzed with speculation about their arrangement, particularly unusual in an era when most politicians brought wives to the Capitol. But Buchanan's romantic mysteries paled beside his catastrophic leadership. When southern states threatened secession, he declared it illegal, but claimed he had no constitutional power to stop it. While Abraham Lincoln prepared for war, Buchanan spent his final months in office paralyzed by indecision, watching federal arsenals fall to Confederate forces without lifting a finger. The Dred Scott decision happened under his watch, with evidence suggesting he improperly influenced the Supreme Court to issue the slavery-expanding ruling. His administration became a playground for corruption, with government contracts handed out to political allies while the Treasury hemorrhaged money. Cabinet members resigned in disgust as Buchanan proved incapable of governing even his own administration. What visitors find at his grave reveals the final judgment. Buchanan rests in Lancaster, Pennsylvania's Woodward Hill Cemetery beneath a modest stone monument that lists his accomplishments but carefully avoids mentioning his presidency. The inscription focuses on his diplomatic service and legal career, as if those final 4 years in the White House simply never happened. Even in death, the 15th president remains defined by what he failed to do rather than what he accomplished. Warren Gamaliel Harding looked like a president, with his silver hair and commanding presence, but beneath the presidential facade lurked the heart of a small-town philanderer and political puppet. The 29th president promised a return to normalcy after World War I, but delivered instead the most corrupt administration in American history, riddled with scandals that would make modern politicians blush with shame. The Ohio gang turned the White House into their personal casino and brothel. Harding's poker games became legendary, with cabinet positions allegedly decided over cards and whiskey in smoke-filled rooms. His Interior Secretary Albert Fall sold oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bags of cash, creating the Teapot Dome scandal that sent men to prison and destroyed reputations. Meanwhile, Harding's Attorney General Harry Daugherty sold pardons, permits, and government favors like a carnival barker hawking cheap prizes. But Harding's personal scandals burned even brighter than his political ones. His 15-year affair with Carrie Phillips, the wife of his friend, produced love letters so explicit they remained sealed by court order for decades. When that relationship cooled, he began another torrid affair with Nan Britton, 30 years his junior, allegedly fathering her daughter in a White House closet during his presidency. The stress of mounting scandals began crushing the genial president. Rumors swirled about impending indictments, suicides among his cronies, and evidence that would destroy his administration. In 1923, while on a speaking tour designed to restore his reputation, Harding suddenly fell ill in San Francisco. The monument couldn't hide what everyone whispered about. Harding lies in an elaborate marble memorial in Marion, Ohio, designed to project dignity and honor. The circular colonnade and eternal flame speak of presidential grandeur, but visitors know the real story. His wife Florence destroyed his personal papers immediately after his death, fueling decades of speculation about what secrets she was desperate to hide. Even the circumstances of his death remain mysterious, with some historians suggesting Florence may have poisoned him to spare the family further disgrace. Andrew Johnson stumbled into the presidency over Abraham Lincoln's corpse, a drunk tailor from Tennessee who proved that sometimes the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time can destroy a nation's healing. The 17th president arrived at Lincoln's second inauguration, so intoxicated he slurred his speech and rambled incoherently, embarrassing the nation and foreshadowing the disaster his presidency would become. Johnson's impeachment trial became a national spectacle that split the country along party lines and revealed the depths of his political incompetence. He fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in direct violation of the Tenure of Office Act, then dared Congress to do something about it. When they impeached him by a single vote, Johnson survived removal by the narrowest margin in presidential history. One senator's conscience saving his presidency, but not his reputation. His Reconstruction policies turned the post-Civil War South into a nightmare for freed slaves. Johnson pardoned Confederate leaders wholesale while blocking civil rights legislation designed to protect African Americans. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act and fought the 14th Amendment with racist rhetoric that shocked even his own Republican Party. His speeches became infamous for their crude attacks on congressional leaders, delivered in language more suited to barroom brawls than presidential addresses. The president's drinking problems became legendary in Washington society. Cabinet meetings reeked of whiskey, and foreign diplomats reported Johnson's slurred speech and erratic behavior during official functions. His wife Eliza rarely appeared in public, allegedly ashamed of her husband's condition and the scandals surrounding his administration. His grave marker tells a story of defiance until the end. Johnson rests in Greenville, Tennessee, wrapped in an American flag and buried with a copy of the Constitution under his head, as he specifically requested. The monument bears his own words. His faith in the people never wavered. Yet visitors to Andrew Johnson National Cemetery find a man who betrayed the very people he claimed to serve. His presidency remembered as a catastrophic failure that prolonged America's racial wounds for generations. Ulysses S. Grant saved the Union as a general, but nearly destroyed it as president, proving that battlefield genius means nothing when facing the wolves of Washington politics. The 18th president entered the White House as America's greatest military hero since George Washington, but his 2 terms became synonymous with corruption, scandal, and the systematic looting of the federal government by his closest friends. The Credit Mobilier scandal exposed how Grant's allies had sold government railroad contracts to themselves, pocketing millions in taxpayer money while building the Transcontinental Railroad with shoddy materials and inflated costs. His private secretary Orville Babcock led the whiskey ring, a conspiracy that defrauded the government of millions in tax revenue, while Grant defended him despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. Black Friday gold panic of 1869 nearly crashed the American economy when Grant's brother-in-law conspired with financiers Jay Gould and James Fisk to corner the gold market. Grant's last-minute intervention prevented total economic collapse, but the scandal revealed how easily his family connections could be manipulated for financial gain. His presidency became a feeding frenzy for corrupt officials who knew the trusting president would never suspect their betrayals. Grant's personal finances were equally scandalous. Despite earning a president's salary, he accepted expensive gifts from wealthy businessmen seeking government favors. His post-presidency business ventures collapsed in spectacular fashion, leaving the former president nearly penniless and desperate. He died writing his memoirs to support his family, racing against throat cancer to finish the manuscript that would save them from poverty. The tomb's grandeur couldn't mask the shame that followed. Grant's tomb in New York City remains one of America's most impressive presidential monuments, a massive granite mausoleum overlooking the Hudson River that cost more than $600,000 to build through public donations. Yet visitors find a man whose trusting nature enabled the greatest corruption scandals in presidential history, his military glory forever tarnished by the thieves and con men who surrounded his presidency. John Tyler became president by accident and ended his life as a traitor, the only American president to serve in the Confederate government and die as an enemy of the Union he once led. The 10th president earned the nickname His Accidency after William Henry Harrison died just 31 days into his presidency. But Tyler's real scandal was how he abandoned every principle that brought him to power. Tyler's presidency began with betrayal when he vetoed his own party's legislation and fired his entire cabinet except Secretary of State Daniel Webster. The Whigs expelled him from their party, leaving Tyler a president without political support, desperately clinging to power while both parties treated him as a pariah. His marriage to Julia Gardner, 30 years his junior, sparked gossip that the 54-year-old president was more interested in young women than governing the nation. The slavery question dominated his presidency, as Tyler pushed for the annexation of Texas, despite knowing it would trigger war with Mexico and expand slavery into new territories. His secret negotiations with Texas officials bypassed Congress and violated diplomatic norms, setting precedents for presidential power that future leaders would abuse. Critics accused him of starting an unnecessary war to serve Southern slave interests. But Tyler's ultimate betrayal came 20 years later, when he chose the Confederacy over the Union during the Civil War. The former president served in the Confederate House of Representatives, writing legislation to support the rebellion against his own former government. He died in Richmond in 1862 while actively working to destroy the United States of America. For decades, no American flag flew over his grave. Tyler rests in Richmond's Hollywood Cemetery, beneath a monument that celebrates his Confederate service while carefully ignoring his presidency. The grave marker identifies him as a Virginia statesman and Confederate congressman, as if his 4 years as President of the United States never happened. Only in 1915 did the federal government finally acknowledge his presidential service with a small marker, a grudging recognition of the president who became a traitor to his own country. Grover Cleveland built his political career on honesty and reform, but his presidency was built on lies, secret surgery, and a scandal involving an illegitimate child that nearly destroyed his campaign before it began. The 22nd and 24th president proved that even the most principled politicians carry secrets dark enough to topple governments and ruin lives forever. The Maria Halpin affair erupted during Cleveland's first presidential campaign when opponents revealed his relationship with a Buffalo widow who bore his child out of wedlock. Cleveland supporters expected denials, but the candidate shocked everyone by admitting the truth. He had fathered Oscar Folsom Cleveland and paid for the child's support. His brutal honesty turned a potential campaign killer into a testament to his character, but the scandal revealed Cleveland's capacity for compartmentalizing his public virtue and private behavior. Cleveland's secret cancer surgery in 1893 became one of the most elaborate medical cover-ups in presidential history. Aboard a friend's yacht, surgeons removed a malignant tumor from Cleveland's mouth while the public believed he was on a fishing vacation. The operation left Cleveland disfigured and speaking with a lisp, but the administration maintained the fiction of a healthy president while the country faced the worst economic depression in its history. The president's marriage to Frances Folsom, his former law partner's daughter, raised eyebrows throughout Washington society. Cleveland had known Frances since her birth and served as her unofficial guardian after her father's death, making their romance feel inappropriate to critics who whispered about grooming and abuse of trust. The 21-year-old bride became the youngest first lady in history, marrying a man 37 years her senior in a White House ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a love match. The truth carved in stone was nothing like the truth he lived. Cleveland rests in Princeton Cemetery beneath a simple granite headstone that lists his birth and death dates with no mention of his presidency or accomplishments. The modest grave reflects his stated desire for simplicity, but visitors know the real story. A president whose public integrity masked private scandals that would have destroyed lesser men, his legacy forever complicated by the secrets he carried to his grave. Lyndon Baines Johnson wielded power like a medieval king, using physical intimidation, emotional manipulation, and raw political cunning to bend Washington to his will. The 36th president's legendary Johnson treatment involved cornering senators in hallways, grabbing their lapels, and looming over them with his 6'4" frame until they surrendered to his demands. But the same ruthless tactics that passed civil rights legislation also dragged America into the Vietnam War and created scandals that haunted him until his death. The Pentagon Papers revealed how Johnson systematically lied to Congress and the American people about Vietnam, escalating a minor conflict into a full-scale war based on fabricated intelligence and manufactured crises. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which Johnson used to justify massive military intervention, was largely fictional, but by the time the truth emerged, 58,000 Americans were dead and Johnson's presidency was in ruins. Johnson's personal behavior shocked even hardened Washington insiders. He conducted meetings while sitting on the toilet, forced staff to watch him swim naked in the White House pool, and bragged about his sexual conquests with a crudeness that embarrassed diplomats and cabinet members. His treatment of Secret Service agents and White House staff bordered on abuse, with screaming tantrums and humiliating punishments that revealed a man drunk on power and contempt for anyone he considered beneath him. The Bobby Baker scandal exposed Johnson's connection to influence peddling and financial corruption that reached back to his Senate days. Baker, Johnson's former aide, was convicted of fraud and conspiracy, but investigations suggested the vice president and later president had received kickbacks and illegal campaign contributions that were never fully prosecuted. Even his final words were about the scandals that haunted him. Johnson died at his Texas ranch in 1973. Reportedly clutching his chest and gasping about Vietnam and the lives lost because of his decisions. He rests beneath a simple granite marker at the LBJ Ranch, surrounded by the hill country landscape he loved, but visitors know the truth. Here lies a man whose appetite for power consumed not only his presidency, but the lives of countless young Americans who died in his war. Franklin Pierce entered the White House as the youngest president in American history, but his administration became a catastrophic failure fueled by alcohol, personal tragedy, and political decisions that pushed the nation towards civil war. The 14th president's life read like a Greek tragedy, with each triumph followed by devastating loss and each attempt at leadership ending in national disaster. Pierce's presidency began with unimaginable personal horror when his 11-year-old son Benjamin was killed in a train accident just weeks before the inauguration. The boy was decapitated before his parents' eyes, and Pierce's wife Jane believed God had taken their child as punishment for Franklin's political ambitions. The trauma shattered both parents, turning Jane into a reclusive ghost who held seances in the White House, and Pierce into a man who sought solace in whiskey bottles. The Kansas-Nebraska Act became Pierce's political suicide note, repealing the Missouri Compromise and allowing slavery to spread into territories where it had been forbidden. The legislation triggered Bleeding Kansas, a violent preview of the Civil War that left hundreds dead and the Democratic Party permanently split. Pierce's support for pro-slavery forces in Kansas earned him the hatred of abolitionists, while his weak leadership disgusted even Southern allies. Pierce's drinking became legendary throughout Washington, with cabinet meetings postponed due to the president's condition and foreign diplomats reporting his slurred speech during official functions. His wife Jane rarely appeared in public, allegedly ashamed of Franklin's behavior and still mourning their dead son. The White House became a tomb-like place where grief and alcohol poisoned every decision. His gravestone became a monument to political failure. Pierce rests in Old North Cemetery in Concord, New Hampshire, beneath a modest granite marker that lists his military service and presidency, but carefully avoids mentioning his accomplishments, perhaps because there were none worth celebrating. The inscription focuses on his early legal career, as if his 4 years as president were best forgotten. Even in death, Pierce remains the president historians consistently rank among the worst, his legacy defined by the disasters he caused and the Union he helped tear apart. Chester Alan Arthur ascended to the presidency through corruption and murder, a machine politician whose entire career was built on graft, kickbacks, and the systematic looting of the federal government through the spoils system. The 21st president became leader of the free world only because Charles Guiteau assassinated James Garfield, elevating a man who had never been elected to national office and whose qualifications consisted entirely of his skill at political bribery. Arthur's pre-presidential career was a masterclass in 19th century corruption. As collector of the Port of New York, he transformed the Custom House into his personal political machine, employing thousands of workers who kicked back portions of their salaries to Republican campaigns. Arthur himself earned more money than the President of the United States through a system of fees and percentages that made him wealthy while ships waited for days to clear customs. The stalwart faction of the Republican Party chose Arthur as Garfield's running mate, specifically because he represented the corrupt old guard that Garfield promised to reform. When Garfield won the presidency and began dismantling the spoils system, Arthur found himself frozen out of decision-making, reduced to a ceremonial figurehead while the president systematically destroyed everything Arthur had built his career upon. Garfield's assassination transformed Arthur overnight from political pariah to president, but the circumstances of his elevation haunted his entire administration. Guiteau claimed he killed Garfield to make Arthur president, making Arthur the unwilling beneficiary of presidential murder. The new president spent his entire term trying to distance himself from his corrupt past while proving he deserved the office that violence had thrust upon him. The elegant monument hid the corrupt deals that made him. Arthur rests in Albany Rural Cemetery beneath an elaborate bronze angel that seems to offer him absolution for his sins. The monument was funded by wealthy New Yorkers who had profited from his corrupt custom house operations, their final gift to the man who had made them rich through political favoritism. Yet visitors know the truth. Arthur reformed the very system that had made him president, spending his final years trying to atone for the corruption that defined his early career. James Abram Garfield appeared to be the perfect president, a self-made man who rose from log cabin poverty to the White House through intelligence, hard work, and political skill. But the 20th president's brief administration revealed a man whose past was stained with financial corruption and whose death exposed scandals that would have destroyed his presidency had he lived to face them. The Credit Mobilier scandal ensnared Garfield years before his presidency when he accepted stock shares from the Union Pacific Railroad Construction Company in exchange for favorable legislation. Congressional investigators found evidence that Garfield had received dividends and loans that constituted clear bribery, but the future president denied wrongdoing with lawyerly precision that fooled no one who understood the evidence. Garfield's affair with Lucia Calhoun, a New York widow, produced passionate love letters that revealed a married man's double life throughout his congressional career. The correspondence, kept secret until after his death, showed Garfield writing intimate declarations to his mistress while publicly championing family values and Christian morality. His wife Lucretia suffered through years of humiliation as Washington society whispered about her husband's infidelities. The salary grab scandal of 1873 saw Garfield vote himself and his congressional colleagues a retroactive pay raise, while ordinary Americans struggled through economic depression. The public outrage forced most congressmen to return the money, but Garfield kept his increase, claiming he needed the funds to support his family while maintaining his secret relationship with Lucia. Charles Guiteau's assassination of Garfield after just 4 months in office transformed him from a potentially scandal-ridden president into a martyred hero, but the truth was more complicated. What they buried with him was darker than the assassination. Garfield's tomb in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery became a magnificent monument to presidential martyrdom, complete with bronze reliefs depicting his rise from poverty to power. Yet visitors who know the real story find a man whose death saved him from scandals that would have rivaled those of any president on this list. His assassination, ensuring his secrets died with him. Richard Milhous Nixon destroyed the presidency itself, transforming the White House into a criminal enterprise where paranoia, revenge, and illegal surveillance became standard operating procedure. The 37th president's name became synonymous with corruption on a scale so massive it required creating a new suffix for political scandals. Yet Watergate was just the tip of an iceberg that included burglary, bribery, obstruction of justice, and the systematic abuse of federal agencies to destroy political enemies. The Watergate break-in began as a third-rate burglary but exploded into a constitutional crisis that revealed Nixon's administration as a criminal conspiracy reaching into every corner of the federal government. Nixon's secret White House tapes captured him ordering the CIA to obstruct the FBI investigation, discussing hush money payments to the burglars, and planning the destruction of evidence, with the casual tone of a mob boss organizing a hit. But Watergate was merely Nixon's final act in a decades-long pattern of criminal behavior. The Pentagon Papers leak triggered Nixon's creation of the White House Plumbers, a secret unit that burglarized psychiatrists' offices and planned illegal surveillance operations against American citizens. The enemies list targeted journalists, politicians, and private citizens for harassment by federal agencies, turning the IRS and FBI into personal weapons of political revenge. Nixon's paranoia consumed his presidency as he installed recording systems throughout the White House, wiretapped his own staff, and surrounded himself with criminals who shared his contempt for law and democracy. The Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon fired prosecutors investigating his crimes, revealed a president willing to destroy the Justice Department rather than face accountability for his actions. The cover-up became more criminal than the original crimes, as Nixon authorized perjury, witness intimidation, and the payment of hush money to felons. His resignation speech blamed his downfall on political enemies rather than his own criminal conduct, refusing accountability even as he became the first president forced to resign in disgrace. Even in death, the scandals followed him to his final resting place. Nixon rests at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, where his grave overlooks gardens designed to project peace and reflection. Yet the library itself became controversial when the Nixon Foundation controlled its exhibits, whitewashing Watergate and presenting a sanitized version of his presidency that historians condemned as propaganda. Even his funeral became a political scandal when critics argued that honoring Nixon with a state ceremony legitimized his criminal presidency and sent the wrong message about accountability in American democracy.